begin by thanking Halina and her most wonderful team at the Johannesburg Holocaust and Genocide Center. The base and Johannesburg Holocaust and Genocide Center started a relationship that has been most beneficial and of value to both parties, and something that I can say personally I'm very proud of. I'd like to thank Halina in particular and Robert Katz in particular for facilitating and bringing this relationship into reality. There is no doubt that the effect of the Holocaust on the Jewish people is really beyond comprehension. There are very few events in the history of the Jewish people, if any, that can really compare. And as such, there is a tremendous responsibility to ensure that never again is fully understood by as many people as possible. All of humanity needs to make sure that this can never happen again in any place, in any time, in relation to any people whatsoever. As a Jewish community center, as a shul, my motivation is as follows. The world needs to learn and know the lesson of never again. But this really begins with us. It begins with me, it begins with you, it begins with each one of us as individuals. And then, and only then, can surely we can say never again with conviction. It's interesting to note that the Torah, the Chumash, begins with the story of creation. The early commentaries were bothered by this. The Torah is primarily a book of law and not a book of history. So why start with the story of creation? And Rashi, one of the early commentaries, says, quoting from a Talmudic source, from Tehillim, from Psalms, a verse which states, Koach ma'asav higid la'amoy, the strength of his actions to tell his people. The significance of starting with the story of creation is in order to teach the significance of the actions of God in relation to his people. The significance is as follows, that before we can begin to talk to others, before we can begin to preach, before we can begin to teach, we need to have our own knowledge. We need to have our own conviction, and hence our partnership. And my feelings regarding the importance of this education, beyond, never again. And as such, please God, as a result of this partnership, not only will the center be able to do what it is meant to do, but also us as a community will be able to perpetuate the memories of those that were lost, be able to perpetuate the lessons that are necessary for all of us to learn, again, to be repetitive, never again. Thank you again to the Johannesburg Holocaust and Genocide Center. Thank you to Tali and her team. Thank you to Luke Albinski for allowing us this tremendous opportunity. Thank you for including us. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for joining us. And I hand over to my very good friend, Robert Katz.
Thank you, Rabbi, and a welcome to all our listeners, both in South Africa and literally from all over the world. This is, as the Rabbi alluded to earlier, the fourth in the partnership on the Holocaust between the base and the Johannesburg Holocaust and Genocide Center. And Tal, I'd also like to echo what the Rabbi said and thank you very, very much for allowing us the honor and privilege of partnering with you, and B, which I suppose is more important, for the work that you do in honoring the memory of the martyrs who died in the Holocaust and perpetuating and trying to stop the crimes of war crimes and crimes against humanity going forward. And you should be blessed in all the work that you do. Tonight, we are very privileged and proud to host Luke Albinski. Luke is the co-founder of Vantage Capital. Vantage Capital, for our viewers who don't know, is a mezzanine funding business which offers long-term growth capital to mid-sized businesses across the African continent. Before Luke was founded Vantage Capital, Luke was a senior executive of Standard Bank for many, many years, and actually that's where I met Luke for the first time. Brought up in a Polish Catholic home, Luke learned about his Jewish origins relatively late in his life, in his 20s. His interest in Holocaust and genocide history springs obviously from his personal story as the son of a Holocaust survivor, which we're going to hear all about tonight. And look, we really look forward to hearing about it, as well as from Luke's on-the-ground involvement with a non-profit organization during the Bosnian conflict. So without further ado, Luke, we look forward to hearing from you.
Thank you, Rob. Thank you for giving me the chance to speak to such a large audience. I didn't expect as many people to join, and really to speak amongst friends, including my very dear friend Tali, who's been such an inspiration in my life and in my mom's life. So really thank you. And thank you, Rabbi, for your words, because they really sum up what has been the motivation behind my research into the fate of the doctors in the ghetto, which is really to honor their sacrifice, honor their courage, to pay homage to these people who sacrificed everything for others, and for them to be examples for future generations. And I think, Rabbi, you summed it up beautifully in your opening remarks. So without further ado, I'm going to turn on the presentation. Okay, so I think the amount of knowledge around the ghetto doctors really has been largely based on a tremendous amount of research that was done by one amazing person, Dr. Maria Ciesielska. Tali knows her well. She's a Polish Catholic doctor based in Warsaw, a GP, and she spent much of her free time after work for many years researching the fate of these doctors and going through archives in Poland, in Israel, around the world, and writing a book about what they did in the ghetto, about the fate of individual doctors, finding the names of all the Jewish doctors that worked in the ghetto, and just doing an incredible amount of historical research. So we owe a tremendous debt of gratitude to Maria. And when she had done all this work and she had the book ready, she found that no one would publish it. So she self-published it with her own resources. The book went on to win the prize for the best new historical book in Poland. It won other prizes, and Tali and I are busy at the moment getting it translated, and we hope to get it published in the US. So much of the material that follows is really based on this tremendous work of scholarship undertaken by Maria. So the images that you have of the ghetto are, of course, of tremendous suffering, death, deprivation. More than around 100,000 people starved to death or died of typhus, typhoid, and other diseases. But there also was an extremely active system of medical care. And with very limited resources, people worked very, very hard to try and address the massive medical needs of the community. And the system was really quite extensive. You had 2 full-blown hospitals, you had 18 pharmacies, you had laboratories that did analysis, you had a nursing school, the Lama Blum Bielica Nursing School. You had academic studies, research studies that were undertaken into typhus and into hunger disease. And you had a full-blown medical university. All of this under the most unbelievably harsh, dreadful conditions. So I thought maybe the way to talk to you about this medical system in the ghetto would be to focus on the stories of some doctors. And the way I thought we could organize the talk is around doctors clustered around the 2 big hospitals in the ghetto, the Burson and Baumann Children's Hospital, where I will talk to you about doctors such as Anna Braude-Heller, Mark Edelman, and Adina Blady-Szwajger. And then the doctors clustered around the Czyste Old Order Jewish Hospital, doctors such as the Zamenhofs, Halina Rotstein, my grandmother, her first husband, Stanislav Shenitzer. And really, by talking about their fates, we really talk about the fates of those institutions. Now, what you need to know is that these 2 hospitals eventually merged to become the kind of Stavky Street Hospital by the Umschlagplatz, where my grandmother, Halina Rotstein, worked. And then after the Great Deportation, when all the patients and most of the doctors were deported to Treblinka and murdered, the few remaining doctors, with unbelievable courage and tenacity, set up a new hospital on Gesia Street. And that's where doctors like Braude-Heller, like Blady-Szwajger, like Edelman, Marek Edelman, who was the only surviving leader of the Jewish ghetto uprising, like Dr. Margolis Edelman, his future wife. They worked there, they lived there, and in some cases they died there. So this is a busy slide, but it kind of sets out the order of the talk. I'm going to first talk about Burson and Baumann. Then I'm going to talk about Gesia Street Hospital, the one that was started up after the Great Deportation. And I'm going to end up with the Czyste Old Order Jewish Hospital because that's the most personal story. That's the story of my grandmother. And that explains why, you know, a fund manager and Rob, thank you for the pitch that you made in favor of my business. I do appreciate that very much. So that's how a fund manager ends up talking about the ghetto and about doctors in the ghetto. It's for very personal reasons. So starting then with Burson and Baumann, and there really the person to talk about is Dr. Anna Braude-Heller, who was the most incredible woman. She started her medical studies in, well, she actually started studies in humanities in Geneva in the early 1900s. She then moved on to Zurich, studying medicine in Zurich, then in Berlin. And she finished off her medical studies in St. Petersburg. And what I retained from stories about her life in St. Petersburg was that she was an illegal. Under the Tsarist laws of the time, she as a Jew was not allowed to be staying in St. Petersburg. And to sidestep the regulations, while she passed her medical exams and did her medical studies, she would change where she lodged every night. So you can imagine the kind of persistence and perseverance that you needed to be studying medicine, passing exams, and moving lodging every night to stay one step ahead of the Tsarist police. She then went and practiced medicine in a Russian village before coming back to Poland in 1912. And she became a major leader of the Bund. The Bund in Poland was a socialist group, a Jewish socialist group in Poland, really centered around the upliftment of workers, around worker rights, fighting the anti-Semitism that was prevalent in the country at the time. And interestingly enough, totally opposed to Zionism. So the Bundists felt that they need to make space for themselves as Jews in a free, because Poland became independent after the First World War, in a free and democratic Poland. And so they would support open-minded, tolerant leaders like Piłsudski in his efforts to maintain a tolerant Poland that was open to its minorities. Jews were obviously the largest minority in Poland, but there were also a lot of Orthodox, Russian Orthodox people in Poland. There were a lot of Lithuanians, Ukrainians, and so on. And the Bundes supported the Piłsudski government in having a policy of unifying the country and bringing everyone together, all those minorities together. So Dr. Heller launched herself into a tremendous range of social activities. She started up a very strong association called the Friends of Children Society. And that society set up all kinds of educational institutions. They set up a sanatorium outside Warsaw, which treated thousands of kids for tuberculosis. And that sanatorium was also a tremendous story of building relationships, building bridges between Polish Jews and Polish Catholics, because that sanatorium treated kids from all religious backgrounds. But maybe what her proudest achievement was the Burson and Baumann Children's Hospital. Now, the Burson and Baumann Children's Hospital had been an institution which had been started up in 1878 by Maya and Chaya Burson and their daughter Paulina Baumann. And they had established this new hospital. Initially, it was just 27 beds. Funded that hospital. It was built 1878. And it became the finest children's hospital in Poland. And Dr. Heller worked in that hospital from about 1912, 1913. Korczak worked there as a pediatrician for a while. But after the First World War, and in the period of high inflation that followed that, the trust that ran the finances of the hospital and effectively kept the hospital going went bankrupt. And so the hospital closed its doors in 1923. And what Dr. Heller was able to do was find the funds from the Warsaw Jewish community and from the Joint Distribution Council in the US to restart the hospital in 1930. She became the director of the hospital, and she built it to become, again, just an amazing institution, 250 beds, the most modern treatments, the most modern equipment, just an amazing place. And so she was instrumental in getting this hospital restarted and off the ground. Now, during the war, the hospital was lucky in that it wasn't bombed like the Czyste hospital where my grandmother worked was bombed, but it was completely overrun with patients. You had hundreds of adult patients that were housed there. At one stage, because of the intense bombing, fires started all around the hospital, and the kids had to be moved into nearby apartments. There was a Polish family that had a large apartment nearby that opened it for the Jewish kids from the hospital, and so it was a terrible time. Then when this is, by the way, this slide is of a nursing school, photo of some nurses at the nursing schools. The hospital also had a kind of academic capacity to it. And so for young doctors, Dr. Heller, who as the director of this institution was, as this is one quote, the embodiment of all the dreams and longings of a young adept in pediatric medicine. Outstanding organizer and social activist. She was quite a romantic figure. So you might think of her as, you know, a Tally Nates in doctor's gowns. When the ghetto was set up, the Bosnian and Bauman Hospital was incorporated into the ghetto. It was actually on the one end of the ghetto. It was part of the ghetto. And it had to face the challenges of having hundreds, if not thousands, of incredibly malnourished, starving kids, many dying of typhus, of typhoid, kids coming literally to the hospital to die. They were coming off the streets. Many of them had lost their families had died already, and they were coming to die in this hospital. And many a time there wasn't a lot that the doctors could do. They had very limited stock of medicine, very little food. And so I can imagine that for a woman who dedicated her life to the welfare of children, who had set up this society of the Friends of Children, who had run a world-class institution, to now be faced with this tidal wave of death and misery, with all these little children dying in her wards, must have been some terrible form of torture. And this is another quote from Adina's book, where she says, she died together with every child who could not be saved, and she continued to rebuild the ruined hospital over and over again. One of the things that Dr. Heller did was participate in research that was done on hunger. There was so much hunger in the ghetto that the doctors decided that they would do a research project on the effects of hunger. And that research project would obviously have an academic objective, but would also have an objective of bearing witness to the suffering of the Jewish community in the ghetto. And so about 30 doctors participated in this hunger research. the work was published in 1946 after the war by Emil Apfelbaum. And yeah, it's just incredible to think that in those circumstances, these doctors facing the challenges they did still had the strength and the fortitude to engage in research activities. And this is an interesting quote in that regard, where Adina says, not only did the doctors in the ghetto not cease to be doctors, but to the very last moment, they kept working scientifically, thinking up those who would come after them. The last meeting of this group was held in August 1942, during the action. The action was the Great Deportation to Treblinka, where over 250,000 Jews were deported. That took place between July and September 1942. Dr. Miakowski informed those who gathered that this was the last session and told them where the report will be hidden, in the cemetery, among other locations. As I mentioned, the report was found and was published in 1946. And here, the sentence that sends shivers down my spine: a week after this meeting, almost all of the participants were dead. So in August 1942, before August 1942, in October 1941, Dr. Heller, with, again, just unthinkable amounts of resilience and strength, actually opened a second branch of this hospital on the corner of Leszno and Zelazna Street. So that is here. And that was like a second branch of the hospital, where there were another 400 beds that were made available to children suffering primarily from malnutrition. And then let me see, it's frozen now. And then in August 1942, the Bosnian Hospital, the small ghetto, was liquidated. The Bosnian Hospital building was closed down, and all the staff and the patients were moved into that Leszno branch that I talked about previously, and then onto Stavki Street, where the two hospitals were merged into one. And this is the building which then housed the merged Stavki 6. Tali and I visited it recently in Warsaw. And that was the building that housed the merged hospitals, Bosnian and Czyste. And this building was right next door to the Umschlagplatz. So many people would get smuggled out of the Umschlagplatz, avoid deportation by getting smuggled into this building, pretending to be either patients or staff. Nurses would go around handing out doctors' gowns, nurse aprons, and so on, so people could pretend to be hospital staff, and then smuggled back into the ghetto, really to live another day. And that's where, and I'll get there, my grandmother ended up working. So now we talk briefly about Dr. Adina. So Dr. Adina, as you'll see from this slide, worked at the Bosnian Hospital, but whereas Dr. Heller was the director, Dr. Adina was a young, newly minted doctor. She had just completed her medical studies in 1939. During the siege of Warsaw, she had run her own little nursing station in the streets of Warsaw. And then soon thereafter, she joined the hospital really as a young intern in the internal medicine division. And you know, she recounts how initially, you know, it was a normal hospital. Things were still orderly, clean. You know, the hospital ran along the kind of normal ways, and then how over time it just became this absolute morass of dead and dying children. Just an unbelievable place of suffering and misery. Adina, as a doctor of that hospital, was initially protected when the Great Deportation started in July. But she saw all these people going to the Umschlagplatz, and she wrote these incredibly moving lines I found. They kept going past, and there seemed to be no end, she wrote. Old men with grey beards and children and women in summer dresses and coats and women in raincoats and bundles, all for the long trip ahead. But eventually it was the turn of the hospital itself. The Nazis arrived. They intended to empty the hospital of all its patients and send them to their deaths at Treblinka. And this is where Dr. Adina did something really unbelievable, very difficult to talk about even. I'll read it to you. We grabbed a teaspoon and we went into the infant's room. And just like for the last 2 years of real work in the hospital, I was leaning over the beds now. I was pouring into those little mouths their last medicine. And there were screams coming from the downstairs because Lithuanians and Germans were already there and were taking the sick from their rooms to train cars. Then we went to the older children and I told them it was medicine so that it wouldn't hurt them. They believed me and drank from the cup as much as they were told. Then I told them to undress, lay in bed and have a nap. They obeyed and laid down. After several minutes, I don't remember how many, when I returned to the room, they were already asleep. And I don't know what happened next. And there's been a lot of debate about what she did, effectively killing the kids in her care. But the view that I hold and that others hold was that it was also a form of resistance. It was a way to spare the children the trauma of what lay ahead, and to preserve some sort of dignity for them in their last moments. So Adina left the ghetto late, just before the uprising. She became a courier on the Aryan side, helping to bring arms, food, messages between the Aryan side and the fighters in the Jewish ghetto, in the Warsaw Ghetto. And then after the Warsaw Ghetto uprising was crushed, she was part of a network that kept Jews alive in the Aryan side and kept a Jewish resistance movement alive in the Aryan side. And then when the Warsaw Uprising of 1944 happened, she participated as a nurse in tending the wounded. The Warsaw Uprising of 1944 had over 200,000 victims. The entire city of Warsaw was completely destroyed. And this picture is actually an amazing one that I found. It's a picture of the underground army, the AK, liberating a jail called the Genocide in the ghetto, and liberating 343 Jews during the uprising. Most of these Jews then joined the underground army and most died in the battles that followed with the Nazis. So after these traumatic experiences that Adina had gone through at the Burson and Baumann Hospital, she stayed quiet for 40 years. And then she grew ill, and suddenly she felt there was no time, she had to write. She says here, I was constantly in the presence of the past, she writes, and I started to hurry. And so fortunately, before her death in 1993, she was able to publish a book, I Remember Nothing More, which is available on Amazon for people that may want to read it. But it's an incredible story of courage, of resilience, of witness, of being a witness. So that's the Burson-Baumann story. You've heard about Dr. Heller. You've heard about Adina Blady-Szwajger. I'm now going to talk briefly about Gesia Street, which was a hospital that was set up after the Great Deportation. And the primary witness to the establishment of this hospital is Dr. Halina Rotstein, who was a nurse at the time, and who stayed in the Gesia Street Hospital with Dr. Heller and with Dr. Adina Blady-Szwajger. And you can see here, here is Gesia Street. Here is where the hospital was set up, 6 Gesia Street. Yeah, it's quite incredible that after, thousands of patients, hundreds of doctors had been deported from the Stavky 6 hospital. The few that survived, instead of just going into hiding or whatever, they actually went back and set up a new hospital, found equipment from the old hospitals, and re-established themselves in some abandoned apartments and warehousing, and essentially set up a new hospital on Gesia Street. Here's a picture of Gesia Street, the corner of Gesia Street. And this hospital treated hundreds of patients. There was still, even after the Great Deportation, there was something like 60,000 Jews left in the ghetto. 30,000 were working, 30 to 40,000 were working in the workshops and therefore had been spared. They were all kind of able-bodied adults. By that stage, there weren't that many children around. Most of the children, the old people had been killed. And then there were about 25,000 other Jews that had managed to escape the deportations, and they were hiding out in the ghetto. And the hospital carried on treating these people in this period after the Great Deportation, where everyone knew that their lives were now numbered in months, if not weeks. And then in January 1942, there was an order to deport the rest of the Jews. The Nazis attempted to do this deportation, but the Jewish combatants were ready. They joined the Jews that were being led to the Umschlagplatz, and then just before the Umschlagplatz, they turned against the Nazi guards and started firing. And as a consequence of that, only about 5,000 Jews got deported, and then the whole deportation exercise was halted. So this was the first time that there was Jewish resistance to this deportation process. And the hospital, of course, wasn't spared. So the Nazis arrived at the hospital, 350 patients and doctors were put on trucks and taken away, and infants that couldn't be put on the trucks were shot in their cots. People that had broken bones, couldn't move, were shot in their beds. And so the doctors that were hiding, when they emerged from the hiding, they found a scene of from a horror movie in that hospital. And yet, you know, at that stage, after all of that, the doctors, some of them then decided to go over to the Aryan side. So Dr. Halina Rotstein at that point moved to the Aryan side and became, like Dr. Adina, she became a courier supporting the resistance. Others, like Dr. Heller, you know, set about cleaning up the hospital and restarting operations. It's just difficult to imagine. And then, of course, April 1942 happened, and the final push to liquidate the ghetto started. And the doctors hid in Gesia Street in various bunkers underground. The bunkers were located kind of late April, 19th, 20th, 21st of April. Those bunkers were located, and people were asked to leave. Few agreed, and then the bunkers were firebombed, and many people died that way. Others were executed on the spot or taken to concentration camps. It's unclear how Dr. Heller, the director of the Bosnian and Bauman Hospital, died. We hope that she used the cyanide that we were told she had. Some say that her hideout was firebombed. It's unclear, but there was a memorial stone laid in her honor in 2001, because she really was quite a memorial plaque. She was really quite an amazing woman. Dr. Halina, as I mentioned to you, she became a courier for the resistance. She moved over to the Aryan side, and she's really credited with saving the life of Marek Edelman. Marek Edelman was one of the leaders of the Warsaw Ghetto uprising. He was a doctor at the Bosnian and Bauman Hospital. He escaped to the sewers after the ghetto uprising was crushed. He then participated in the 1944 Warsaw uprising. And after that uprising was crushed and Warsaw was emptied of all of its inhabitants, he stayed behind in the ruins of Warsaw. This is what Warsaw looked like after the uprising was crushed, to carry on the fight. And Halina got word that you know, his position in the ruins was becoming more and more untenable. The SS were gradually tightening their noose around the area of ruins where Marek Edelman and his squad were operating, and it was only a matter of time before they would be discovered and killed. And so she volunteered on, you know, what one would think would be a suicide mission to go back into Warsaw, posing as a kind of hospital team, and bring these fighters out through the SS lines, you know, as wounded civilians. And this is what she did. A group of 7 set out in search of Marek Edelman and his combat group in the ruins of Warsaw. They passed the SS lines. They found Marek Edelman, they put them on stretchers, and then they walked them back out past one set of SS lines where they were busy, the SS men were busy having dinner and didn't really bother. Past the second set where one of the SS men noticed that one of the wounded men on the stretchers was wearing boots and started shouting, "Bandit, bandit." And Dr. Halina assured him that no, it was a typhus patient, he mustn't come close, and they were let through. And that's how the last surviving leader of the Warsaw Ghetto uprising was saved. And after the war, Dr. Halina married Marek Edelman, and they both settled in Łódź and lived there, both practicing medicine in Łódź before Dr. Halina emigrated to France in 1968. Marek Edelman, as you know, stayed in Poland throughout the time and died in Poland. So that's the Burson and Baumann story, the Gesia Street story. I now want to talk about the Czyste Old Order Jewish Hospital, which is where my grandmother worked. And there, I want to talk to you about Dr. Zofia Zamenhof, who was a doctor who was educated in Lausanne and who was the daughter of Ludwig Zamenhof, who invented Esperanto. And then so she studied in Lausanne. She came back. She started working at the Czyste Old Order Jewish Hospital, which was an amazing institution. It was the most modern hospital in Poland. It had 17 separate buildings, 8 hospital pavilions, a synagogue, laboratories, just the most extraordinary facilities. And when Warsaw was attacked, and there was a siege of Warsaw that lasted from the 8th of September to the 28th of September, obviously this big modern hospital, the Czyste Hospital, was really on the front lines and received something like 5,000 wounded people. It was also bombed. The operating theater was taken out. Various other facilities in the hospital were blown up. So it really suffered during the siege of Warsaw. And then after the siege, there was a typhus epidemic. There was quarantine. The Nazis forced all non-Jews to leave the hospital. They stopped all payments to this hospital and to the Burson Baumann Hospital, leaving the hospitals completely starved of funds and completely dependent on the Jewish community and the Judenrat to survive. The director of the hospital was Adam Zamenhof, Zofia Zamenhof's brother, an ophthalmologist who actually invented a device in the 30s to locate blind spots. Very innovative doctor, amazing individual. And soon after the Nazis arrived in Warsaw, Zofia Zamenhof and her brother Adam, and indeed Adam's wife Wanda Zamenhof, were all taken into custody by the Gestapo. And Adam Zamenhof was, as the director of the Czyste Hospital, was then shot dead at Palmary. Zofia Zamenhof and her sister-in-law Wanda, Adam's wife, went back to the Czyste Hospital. They were released in early 1940. And then, they worked in the Czyste Hospital. They would have known my grandmother well. And they found themselves, Wanda Zamenhof found herself taken to the Umschlagplatz, ready to board the trains to Treblinka. And she managed to escape again by putting on doctor's gowns and by being part of the kind of medical service that was operating around the Umschlagplatz. And then she got false papers and got smuggled out of the ghetto by a Catholic priest, Father Marcelli Godlewski. Now, Father Marcelli Godlewski was the priest at the All Saints Church in the ghetto. It was a church that operated in the ghetto for about 2,000 Jews that had converted to Catholicism. But this church was, Father Godlewski opened it to all comers and, distributed food to hundreds of people, produced huge numbers of false baptismal certificates so people could escape the ghetto and try and survive on the Aryan side, link people up with, because he was able to move in and out of the ghetto, he was able to pass tremendous amounts of communication from the ghetto to the outside, to the area side, and smuggled children out of the ghetto to stay at his home in Anin, a village, a small town outside Warsaw. And for his efforts, he was commended by Yad Vashem as a righteous among nations, a Catholic priest. But what is most surprising is that this Godlewski, before the war, was a militant anti-Semite. So here we have a quote from Hirschfeld where he reads, "I remember his name, I get choked up. Passion and love in one soul. Once a militant anti-Semite, the priest waged war in his writings and from his pulpit. But when fate confronted him with the depth of human misery, he flung away his previous attitude and dedicated his passionate heart to Jews." Incredible story. So Zofia Zamenhof ended up deciding to go with her patients to Treblinka, and she was deported, whereas Wanda Zamenhof, a sister-in-law, was hidden on the Aryan side and after the war emigrated to France. So now I talk about something much more personal. My grandmother, Dr. Halina Rotstein, who was educated at Warsaw University, got a degree in 1930, worked at the Infant Jesus Hospital in Warsaw, and met her husband at the university, and met also the people that were to save my mom's life and my uncle's lives, the Dr. Trojanowski and Dr. Radlinska. These were Catholic doctors working at the Infant Jesus Hospital that became good friends with my grandmother. My grandmother married Dr. Stanisław Szenica. Apologies for the picture. Still haven't worked out how to get rid of these white spots. And they were both very hardworking doctors in the 30s, earning very little. Doctors were extraordinarily poorly paid for their qualifications. Halina specialized in dermatology and venereal disease, and she was very highly regarded before the war. But they eventually got divorced, and Halina married a rich Jewish industrialist, Vladislav Rotstein, and they moved to Kutno, where my mom and her brothers were born before the war. Now, when the war arrived, Vladislav Rotstein, as a Jewish entrepreneur, as an industrialist, as someone who was part of the Polish war effort, had joint ventures with the Polish Ministry of Defense, was obviously had a massive target on his back. So he sought to escape to Romania as the Nazis attacked Poland. And he was captured by the Soviets in Lvov, and basically spent the rest of his life in the Soviet Union. Halina Rotstein was left with the kids in Kutno, She participated in looking after the many wounded soldiers and civilians in Kutno, because Kutno was massively bombed. It was a huge, of huge strategic importance with all the railway lines that centered around Kutno and the various military barracks there. And so she spent her time in the hospitals there, tending for the wounded. There's a story about how a wounded soldier was crying out for his mom, and eventually Halina held his hand and said, "Your mom's here," and then he died. So in early 1940, she came to Warsaw, and this is a picture still in Kutno before the war, with my mom and with my grandmother and my uncles. And this is a picture in 1940 in Warsaw with the youngest Stash, who's born by then. And my mom's there with her little dog. And so she came and started working at the Czyste Old Order Hospital, the Zamenhof's hospital. And then she obviously registered as a doctor. She got stamped Jew. Here's the Nazi registration form, which was basically a death sentence. And then once the ghetto was set up, because Czyste Hospital was outside the ghetto, essentially the hospital was split up. And there were various parts of the hospital that were located on different streets within the ghetto. And you know, initially, at least at the beginning of the Great Deportation, hospital staff were safe. They had the papers that allowed them not to be deported, but obviously that changed after a while. And eventually, the directors of the hospital, the senior doctors, were asked to choose who could stay and who could go. And this was just a most terrible thing to ask anyone to do. Here, Dr. Adolf Polushik talks about it being the most tragic moment of my life. While reading out the list, I handed out a death sentence to 600 innocent people. 600 innocent people. I was obliged to read through the list several times. They did not believe that they had not been included in the list. They had deluded themselves that they had not heard properly, or that perhaps I had skipped over their names. Fear and desperation took hold of everyone. Even those who were on the list were bitterly angry at those who had compiled the list who were included on it. I consoled them with the hope that another list would be made up, although I myself did not believe this was true. So Czyste and Burson merge on Stawki Street, and Halina Rotstein, my grandmother, is essentially running that hospital, making sure there's enough food, the food isn't stolen. She's got a clinic on the Umschlagplatz, a little shed where babies that are abandoned when the wagons leave are tended for. Sometimes there are 20, 30 babies left on the ground after people had left on the trains, and this is what she has to face. There comes a point where she's told to leave the ghetto. She's got a life card. She can leave. She can escape to the Aryan side. She gives the life card away. Again, a second time, she's offered a way out. She decides to go with the patients to Treblinka. And there's Halina at the Umschlagplatz Memorial in Warsaw. And these are the quotes of eyewitnesses. Halina Rotstein, went to a wagon voluntarily to be with those needing her help. This is how she understood her duty. To many, such a gesture seemed anomalous, for the will to survive was so strong. However, this atypical deed was very poignant in its heroism. And then another quote, how calm was this woman, perhaps just a little younger than me, in the middle of unparalleled uproar and the general anxiety in the hospital. When it became clear that the heads would leave the hospital, Dr. Rotstein did not hesitate and took everything under her control. The children walked by themselves, with only some of them being carried away in arms. Adult patients were usually transported on stretchers. This was horrible, incomparably more horrible than a procession of healthy people walking towards their demise. And that's my mom at Treblinka. So there you have it. Burson and Bauman Hospital, Czyste Old Order Hospital, the fates of the various doctors from both hospitals, how the hospitals merged on Stavky Street, and then the Gesia Street hospital that was set up afterwards. And I guess, you know, thinking about it all, this poem from Zbigniew Herbert, who's one of Poland's greatest poets, really makes sense to me as I try and think about why my grandmother decided to go to her death rather than to save herself. I was very young and common sense told me not to give my word. I could easily say, I'll give it some thought. What's the big hurry? It's not a train schedule. But time exploded. There was no before, there was no after. In the blinding present, you had to choose. So I gave my word. A word, a noose around my neck, an ultimate word. In the rare moments where everything is light and becomes transparent, I think to myself, my word, how I'd like to take my word back. It doesn't last long. The world's axis screeches. So my mom was with her three brothers taken out of the ghetto by two incredibly brave individuals, Halina Rotstein and Janina Radlinska. She went through this courthouse, which it's hard to believe, but it was a courthouse which basically worked on both sides of the wall. So there was a Jewish side of the courthouse and there was an Aryan side of the whole courthouse. And if you had the right papers and had bribed the right people, you could basically walk through the courthouse, out the other end, and into the Aryan side of Warsaw. And that's how my mom and her brothers left the ghetto. And this is my mom and the courthouse today. And this is the man who engineered the escape, Dr. Trojanowski, extraordinary Polish Catholic doctor. He spent much of the war saving Jews. He performed more than 50 operations to reverse circumcisions so that Jewish men could survive on the Aryan side, because for obvious reasons, Jewish men were incredibly at risk. So he spent much of his time doing these kind of operations, organizing for Jews to be hidden away, organizing for my mom and her brothers to be put into a Catholic orphanage. And he did all of this under the noses of the Germans. I learned from his daughter just a few weeks ago that his flat and his doctor's rooms were right next door, facing a German institution of some kind, with lots of Germans there every day. And his wife Stenia always used to say that it's best to be right under their noses if you're engaging in illegal activities. And that certainly proved to be the case with Dr. Trojanowski. died in 64, and was recognized as a righteous amongst nations in 66. And this is the wonderful orphanage where my mom was hidden away with her 3 brothers. And here she is. That's my mom. And that's my brother Robert, who sadly passed away only a few weeks ago. And my mom will tell you that this was one of the happiest times of her life. For the first time in a long time, remember she was 4 when she entered the ghetto, she was 6 when she left it. She felt safe, she felt secure, there was no discrimination, everyone was an orphan, no one had kids, no one had parents. And she had the most incredibly dedicated teachers. She was absolutely adored Professor Korotai, her kind of tutor. And this is how they survived the war. Finally, one last thing to mention is the university. So a medical university was set up in the ghetto. About 200 students registered for first year medicine. A smaller number, maybe 20, 30 registered for second year medicine. Because they had already had a year at Warsaw University before the war. And essentially from kind of October 41 to about June 42, a full-blown university took place. Exams were passed, people sat exams, wrote exams, and even after successfully completing this first year, even a dance was organized in the ghetto for these students. Very hard to believe, just extraordinary. And sadly, the Great Deportation started a few weeks later in July, and the vast majority of these medical students who had just completed their first year died in Treblinka only a few weeks later. About 50 survived the war. The records of who had completed the exam successfully were passed on to the Warsaw University. And after the war, 50 students got credited that first year of medical studies in the ghetto and were able to continue their medical studies in liberated Poland. And that's the end of the presentation. Happy to answer some questions now.
Thank you so much, Luke, for an unbelievable presentation. Many people are thanking you, and there are some questions, and maybe we will start. And by the way, we are very honored to have 2 Holocaust survivors that were in the Warsaw Ghetto. As Kath mentioned, Pinchas Guta is joining us from Toronto. Pinchas was born in Lodz, was in the Warsaw Ghetto, then in Majdanek, in many other camps. And Ella Blumenthal is joining us from Cape Town. And of course, Ella was from Warsaw, Warsaw Ghetto, Majdanek, Auschwitz, Bergen-Belsen. And maybe they will join us and say a few words later. But maybe, look, if I can start with the first question, and that is from Daniel Bitran. How did Dr. Adina know that the children would be deported to Treblinka? Was it a secret? Did they know the destination? Did they know that they're going to be sent to die?
So because this happened quite late, around September, by that stage, as you know, Tali, there had been a few people that had actually escaped Treblinka and come back and inform people about what was happening. So the doctors certainly, maybe not everyone out there, but the doctors being part of the kind of ghetto elite, certainly were under no illusions at that point what Treblinka meant. And perhaps you want to add to that.
No, absolutely. You're spot on. People escaped from Treblinka, and it was known certainly by September. And maybe I'll just skip to another question by Ashley around how many doctors worked in these hospitals in the Warsaw Ghetto, and were the staff actively part of the resistance? You know, can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yes. So, there were 830 doctors that were members of the Warsaw Białystok Medical Chamber before the war, and that were in the ghetto. But then there were probably some additional doctors that came from other areas like Łódź and so on, that also ended up, for various reasons, in the Warsaw Ghetto. So I think the number of doctors in the ghetto was somewhere between 830 and 1,000. So it was a large number. Let's remember that pre-war Poland, Jewish doctors represented 30–40% of the total doctor community in Poland. And that was also the case in other professions, like legal professions and so on. And so, yeah, there were a large number of doctors. Now, in terms of, you know, the affiliation with the resistance, yes, of course, there were doctors that were actively involved in the resistance. The best example is Marek Edelman, who was one of the leaders of the uprising. But what's also true is that there were doctors that were working with the Jewish police. The Jewish police also had their doctors working for them and for their families. So you had doctors on both sides of the fence.
Absolutely. And maybe, Luke, just speak about how many of them survived. Yes.
So about 100 to 120 survived. So it's about 12 to 14% survived. Doctors in general had a higher chance of survival because they came from the kind of elite of society, obviously with their education and so on, but also because given their profession, they had a lot of relationships with Catholic or Aryan Poles, a lot of professional relationships with them. And those professional relationships were the difference between life and death. So you see it with my grandmother. Why was my mom saved? Why were my uncles saved? Because she had these relationships with Dr. Trojanowski, with Dr. Radlinska. These were doctors that were her peers, that had worked with her in the hospitals in Warsaw before the war. And they did what it took to save our friends.
Thank you. Just a very quick question. Gary Schwartz is asking, was Herbert a Jewish poet? He just really found the poem that you shared very, very moving.
Yeah, it's an incredible poem. But no, Herbert was a Catholic, Polish Catholic. But he wrote some incredible, like Miłosz and like Szymborska and like other great Polish poets. He wrote some incredible poetry about the fate of the Jews of Poland. Yeah, I think it's something that you know, that kind of Polish intellectual really has experienced in a very profound way that loss.
So Jonathan Hertz is asking, please can you tell us a little bit more about your grandfather and the Soviets, and specifically immediately after the war? What happened to your grandfather?
Yeah, my grandfather, I mean, his life story is quite an extraordinary one. He was born to a very wealthy family. His his father had a distillery in Warwich, and anyone can tell you Poles drink a lot. So if you have a distillery, you're making a lot of money. That's kind of obvious. He spent much of the 20s in France. And the reason he spent much of the 20s in France was because he stole from his older brother his fiancée. So his brother was going to get married to a beautiful Polish Jewish ballerina, Zofia Treplova, and then she actually fell for the younger brother. And so that caused so much stress in the family that they actually left for France. It was easier to leave Poland than to kind of stick around and face that kind of music. So they lived in France for much of the 20s. They came back early 30s, and Zofia, who had no faith in Polish doctors, waited too long to have appendicitis treated. She said she didn't trust Polish doctors, and by the time they treated it, it was too late and she died. So that was his first wife. So his brother then, Mieczysław, had forgiven him. He had happily married, gone on married, had kids. It was all water under the bridge. He had forgiven him, and being the kind of wealthy industrialist that he was, he gave his brother Władysław a brand new Chrysler, because he had the Chrysler dealership for all of Poland. He gave him a brand new Chrysler to try and take his mind off his wife who had died and all the tragedy. And Władysław drove that Chrysler too fast and crashed it and ended up in hospital. And who did he meet in hospital? Anyone want to guess? Halina Rotstein. So, Halina was divorced, and there was Władysław, and so that's how they got together. And then, of course, war breaks out, and he leaves. He gets captured by the Soviets, and what saves him from the Gulag is the fact that he was an engineer. So the Soviets say, look, no point wasting his skills, picking up snow in the Gulag. Let's rather get him to run a big chemicals factory in Rostov. So he ends up running this factory, not in name, because obviously in name the boss man was a Communist Party member, but effectively he runs this factory in Rostov. When the Nazis invade the Soviet Union, the factories moved behind the Urals to avoid the Nazis. And then in 1945, he gets entrusted with a very important mission. He gets given the rank of a major in the Soviet army. He gets given a brand new Soviet limousine, the same kind that Stalin drove around in. And he gets entrusted with a mission to go to Berlin. So we have pictures of him May 1945 in Berlin, and dismantle all the industrial equipment that he can find in the Soviet occupied zone of Germany, and transport it back to the Soviet Union. And guess what? When he's dismantling this equipment, he finds his own Kutno Chemicals Works equipment that the Germans had taken away from his Kutno plant when they took over Poland. And he's now dismantling it and sending it back to the Soviet Union. And when he arrives at the Moscow train station, he's greeted by Malenkov, who was to become the premier of the Soviet Union after the death of Stalin, just before Khrushchev. And Malenkov says to him, look, I love all this equipment you've brought back, but where are the limousines? We really wanted to test drive the German limousines, and you haven't brought those back. And then he basically spends the rest of his life in the Soviet Union. He runs a distillery there. He works on various kind of scientific engineering innovations. Eventually, At first, he's in this horrible little village called Krasny in the middle of nowhere. Eventually, after Stalin's death, he's allowed to settle in Rostov. He has a third wife there. He has 2 more kids there. And he lives out his life in the Soviet Union. So it's quite a life that he had.
Absolutely. Look, Leah Emanuel and Cliff Matthews, our friend, are asking related questions. Leah is saying, how did your mother find out that she was Jewish? And Cliff is saying, what were the events that led up to you establishing your Jewish roots?
Look, I think my mom knew. I mean, she was baptized a Catholic in 1945 after the end of the war, with the agreement of Vantage Capital, with the agreement of her father, because her father, coming to Berlin, would transit through Poland and spend time with the kids. But my mom knew that, you know, she wasn't that young when she went into the ghetto. She was born in 36. She left the ghetto in 42, so she was 6 years old. By the time she was baptized, she was 9. So she was well aware of her background. However, she kept it completely hidden from me for my entire childhood. And the only person that spilled the beans on this thing was my cousins, the daughters of the youngest of the uncles, Stash. He's the little baby in the picture. He was born in 1940 after the outbreak of the war, and the cousins told me when I was in my early 20s, hey, do you know who your grandmother was and what happened? And then I went back and confronted my mom and confronted my dad. And then I had tons of therapy to try and get over all of this trauma.
And at that moment, your mother appeared. And here is Vanda. Vanda, hello. Luke's mom is also joining us from Warsaw. Luke, few more questions, if you don't mind, before we close. There's a lot of interest. A lot of people are saying fascinating and thank you, and a lot of stuff that people just didn't know, you know. So Mike Kaplan is asking, what happened to Dr. Trojanowski? Was he ever in danger? You know, what happened to him in communist Poland?
So, so Dr. Trojanowski was always in danger, because his waiting room was a Jewish train station. I mean, there was every second person in his waiting room was a Jew. And the reason for that was because there was actually very few places. Switch it off. She's got to say something. Switch it off. Very few places that Jews could go, you know, on the Aryan side. So there were a lot of Jews that actually got into the Aryan side, and then actually, believe it or not, Tali, they went back to the ghetto because they actually couldn't find anywhere to stay. So the Trojanowski's waiting rooms were known as the place for Jews to go who were looking for help. And, you know, the witnesses that say there were always Jews in his waiting room. And he was forever organizing ways to help them. Now, doing that risked his death, but also the death of his wife and the death of his daughter, Eva. So it really put his whole family's life on the line. And, you know, the first person my mom played with when she left the ghetto and she was staying at the Trojanowskis was Eva. In 1942, as a 6-year-old, she was playing with Eva. And, you know, 70 years later, we were having dinner with Eva in Warsaw a few weeks ago. So it's just extraordinary. So his life was very much in danger. Somehow they were lucky in the sense that before the Warsaw uprising, they left for a kind of vacation home outside Warsaw in Sopolowo. And then his flat in Warsaw, his doctor's rooms, his apartment block in Warsaw took a direct hit during the uprising. So if they had stayed, everyone would have been killed. Took a direct hit, it was completely destroyed. He was in Warsaw during the uprising, obviously helping tend the wounded during the uprising. And then he basically got on a bicycle and cycled to Soplovo, where his wife was staying with her daughter. And then that's how they kind of survived the end of the war. And then after the war, he carried on with his medical career. He was in charge of a medical institute. He was highly regarded as a doctor, as a surgeon, and he died young at the age of 59. But he had, as a doctor, he wasn't involved in politics, so he could just get on with medicine, and he had a life under communist Poland as a very well-respected medical professional.
So look, maybe the last question, because I really want to say hello to a few of the survivors. Pinchas is with us, Vanda, Ella. So maybe just the last question. Pavel Novatsky is asking, did you come across any material relating to medical cooperation between different hospitals in other ghettos? Is there any research about other ghettos and what is happening there?
Now, there's been some research around, the kind of medical infrastructure, medical services across Jewish Poland during the war. It's not something that I personally have spent much time researching, so I can't say much about it. But certainly what we can say with a lot of confidence is that the most developed medical system was in the Warsaw Ghetto. And it was quite extraordinary what was done there under unbelievable conditions, to have a full-blown medical university going, to have full-blown analytical laboratories, to be doing academic research, to have these hospitals going. It was just extraordinary what these people did.
So just finally, look, I know the answer, but maybe just tell Tessa Shelush, did you write the story of your grandmother? Did you write the story of your mother?
Yes, no, I did, and it's really been an amazing journey for me, because it's allowed all these new connections. For example, my grandfather's brother, so my great uncle, he managed to escape to the US with his family, and thanks to my book, we've been able to reconnect with that US family. In fact, my cousin was so moved by the book that I wrote that he got on a plane and came to Poland for the first time in his life and met my mom and her brothers, only a few months before COVID. So the book really kind of spurred all these connections. My mom reconnected with Eva Trojanowska, who she first knew in 1942 as a 6-year-old Jewish kid hiding on the Aryan side. So it's been an amazing journey. And Tali, I've got to thank you, because you've been a big part of that journey.
Always an honor, and Vanda, I love you, you know that. Just to say that Tessa is also saying that there is a very good recent book translated about Jewish medicine in the Warsaw Ghetto, and it's called White Coats in the Ghetto by Miriam Ofer, and your grandmother is mentioned in the book.
Yes, I've seen that, thank you.
So let me do two things. For those that need to go, because it was a long webinar, I want to thank you, Luke, and thank you all for coming from the Johannesburg Holocaust and Genocide Center and the base. I will close properly later. For those that can't stay with us, we have an amazing opportunity. We have 3 survivors here from the Warsaw Ghetto. as I said, from Cape Town, from Toronto, and from Warsaw. I wonder if they want to say a few words. And I don't know if Pinchas, I don't know if you want to say hello to everyone. And if you need to go, please go. Goodbye. We will see you again. And if you can stay, please stay with us.
Well, it's a wonderful opportunity, first of all, to listen to such a extraordinary, way of describing what happened in the Warsaw Ghetto. First of all, it's nice to see you, and now, especially at the pandemic, where we can't actually be each other physically, but we can actually talk to each other. And I just want to tell you that the heroism of the professionals in the Warsaw Ghetto, even as me, when I was 8, 9, 10, and 11 by the time of the uprising and taken to Majdanek, I remember, and I just want to share with you one little vignette about doctors. Before the war, I had double pneumonia. So I survived by miracles, and I had weak lungs. So in the Warsaw Ghetto, food was scarce, and situation was bad. And I started having temperature and starting being ill. So one of the doctors from the Warsaw Ghetto came and said that I need to eat meat. Well, we didn't have meat. So he managed to get horse meat, which and my mother made a broth to feed me. Of course, I refused because it wasn't kosher, but they forced me to have it done. And so this doctor went, with great problems to find horse meat for a little boy that was suffering from having weak lungs. So I just wanted to share with you. And I think from as far as the resistance, I always say, me, that the resistance in the Warsaw Ghetto started right from the beginning. It was spiritual, moral. They did everything that the Nazis didn't allow them. And we knew, even me as a little boy, I knew everything that was going on. So thank you for me being part of this webinar. And I wish everybody a healthy and happy Yom Tov, everything of the best. And let's see this pandemic, the Rebbeinu Shalom will help us, that the pandemic will disappear. Thank you.
Thank you, Pinchas. Thank you, Pinchas, for being here and for sharing this story. Pinchas, of course, came from a Hasidic family. I can only just imagine the horse meat and that situation. But of course, to save your life, that is an amazing story. I don't know, I can see Ella. I don't see the video, but I don't know if Ella wants to say hello and any recollections of doctors or of the medical situation in the Warsaw Ghetto. I don't know if you can join us and say a few words. Ella, can you hear?
She needs to unmute herself.
Yes, you need to unmute.
That's me.
Oh, excellent.
Hello.
Hello, Ella.
I just want to say thank you, Luke, for bringing me back to the ghetto. I was walking with you. I just can't believe it, what you were telling us. I can't digest it. It's impossible. Thank you so much, Luke, for bringing me back. Even if my tears are still coming down, I'm grateful to you for what you've been saying and telling us. Thank you, Luke. And thank you to you, Tali, for organizing it. Thank you. A good year to all of you. Shana Tova.
Shana Tova, Ella, and healthy year. Thank you. Vanda, do you want to say hello? That is Luke's mom. Vanda, that also was in the Warsaw Ghetto as a little girl. Do you want to say a few words about your son and about yourself?
Where were you?
We can't hear you, Vanda. Is it difficult to speak? Yeah. Look, I think maybe there is an issue with the sound.
Yeah, I think so.
Because I think she is speaking, but we can't hear.
The microphone doesn't seem to be working.
Oh, I'm sorry. I'm so sorry.
Let me see if I can phone her.
Maybe you can tell us what.
Yeah. Let me try and get hold of her whilst we carry on.
Okay. Okay. Is there anyone else that stayed that has a connection to the Warsaw Ghetto, either a survivor or a second generation, or anyone that would like to share anything? I see a friend from Ghetto Fighters House, Medin Shachar was here, many others. If there is anyone that would like to, as I said, if you need to go, please do. This is just an extra session just to hear some of your thoughts and connection. Medin.
If Luke has come to Israel with his story, has he participated in the conference? There's a yearly conference about medicine and the Holocaust. So right now I think he's busy with his mom, but if he hasn't come, then we definitely have to make that connection for him to come and tell his story. It's such a different perspective. We always get facts and figures, but we never hear about family and about the spiritual resistance, what it was to be a doctor. So it was incredible. So we have to find out, Tali.
Absolutely, absolutely.
Sure.
Let's do it. Let's make it happen.
We're gonna make it happen.
Anyone else that want to unmute themselves and say anything? Maybe Vanda can join. This is Dominic, that is Luke's brother, younger brother, and he's also in Warsaw. And we have my very good friend from Rwanda, Lorian Kadigwa. Hello, Judge. Nice to see you. No, I think that we have a problem.
Hello,
a microphone. Hello, hello, Lorian.
Nice to see you. Very happy to see you.
Very nice to see you.
I thank so much Luke for his very good presentation, and it can inspire everyone to be courageous and to save life when it is possible. So thank you very much, and I'm very happy to see you again.
Us too. Thank you. Thank you very much. Maybe while they are getting organized, Rabbi Aaron, Rob, if you want to come in and as our partners, maybe to say a word or two. You'll need to unmute yourself, Rabbi.
Tali?
Yes, Cliff. Hello.
Hi. Hi, Luke. I'm sitting in Luke's study at the moment, and the book that was referred to earlier has just arrived and delivered to him, and it's called White Coats in the Ghetto. Thanks very much, Luke. I've heard the story a number of times, and I always am absolutely moved to tears, genuinely to tears, every time that I hear it.
Amazing. I would love to read the book when it's finished. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Cliff. That's very, very moving. Thank you.
So if Vanda can't fix her microphone, very sadly, she's an amazing, amazing woman. Her story will come out also in a publication that we are working on at the moment, of portraits of survivors from all around South Africa. And Luke's book is available in our resource center. So yeah, and maybe Vanda can type a message. So maybe if Dominic can help Vanda to write a message in the chat, that will also be very nice to, because Mike Kaplan is suggesting, like a really good teacher. Thank you, Mike. So maybe Vanda can do that.
Yeah, she's trying to talk through my phone, but I don't know if you can hear anything. No.
No, sadly. Maybe just say what she tried to say,
okay.
Luke.
Just say what you want to say, Mom. Okay, I'll just repeat that. Did you guys get that, or shall I repeat it?
You'll have to repeat. Please
okay,
repeat.
So basically what my mom said was that when she asked Eva, the daughter of Dr. Trojanovsky, why did he help so many Jews? His response was that it was his duty to help any person who was in trouble. It was just a simple duty of humanity. That's what he felt as a doctor and as a human being. That was his duty. He couldn't do otherwise than to help people that were in need. That was the simple message that he gave his daughter Eva. And the other thing my mom said was that what basically I said, that they operated this whole big, for want of a better word, Jewish train station, you know, right under the noses of the Nazis, because there was a German institution of some kind, we're not sure what it was, that was operating right there in the same courtyard. So, so it was extraordinary that they had this whole Jewish smuggling operation going, Jewish operations, circumcisions, nose jobs, everything being done right there within 10 or 20 meters of German officers.
Yeah. Wow.
The other story that Eva told us that was very interesting was that Stenia, Dr. Chernovsky's wife, was an extremely beautiful woman. And one night they were at some night spot in Warsaw during the Nazi occupation, and a Nazi officer or Wehrmacht officer, we don't know who, started kind of bothering Stenia, making some moves on her. And the one thing about Dr. Chernovsky was that he was very, very quiet, retiring person. He never talked about what he did, but he did have a fierce temper. And when he saw this German officer making a move on his wife, he did something that's pretty much a death sentence in Nazi-occupied Poland. He punched the officer in the face.
Sure.
And he punched him so hard. Obviously, the doctor wasn't used to boxing. He didn't take any boxing classes before doing this, that he actually dislocated his shoulder. From the force of the blow, he himself dislocated his shoulder. So not only did they have to run out of that night spot, to try and get away from the Nazis, but they then had to look for medical help late at night to get the shoulder fitted back after this punch.
My goodness, what stories. What stories. So look, I'm going to close now. You missed Meidin Shachar from Ghetto Fighters House invitation. Meidin, maybe just very quickly just invite him again, and then I will close.
Every year in Israel. Hi, Luke. Thank you so much for the presentation. I only knew about Mark Edelman. Now I know about so many other doctors and your grandmother as well. There is a yearly conference in Israel, Medicine and the Holocaust, and I think that we need to make sure that you come
to the next. Glad to come. Just tell me when and where, and I'm on the plane there.
I hope, hopefully next March, April, it depends. But we're one of the hosts, so I am definitely, Tali and I are going to make the connection so that you can tell your story and your mother's story and your grandmother's story and the hundreds of doctors that were part of the Warsaw Ghetto.
No, incredible. Thank you. Really appreciate the invitation.
Amazing. So thank you so much. It was a great honor, first of all, to have those amazing Holocaust survivors with us, Ella, Vanda, Pinchas. What an honor to have you with us tonight. It was a great pleasure to continue our partnership with the base. Rabbi Aaron Zulberg, Robert Katz, thank you so much for your partnership and for the programming that we are doing together. Thank you to everyone from the Johannesburg Holocaust and Genocide Centers team for all your dedicated work tonight. And to all of you that joined us for tonight. Hopefully you will still join us for one more presentation before Rosh Hashanah, and that will be on the 14th of September, on Monday evening at 7 o'clock, and that will be a virtual tour of Budapest, of Mauthausen, of Vienna, of Austria, and of Hungary, with the amazing Jacob Shoshan, the tour guide extraordinaire. Shana Tova, Gmar Chatima Tova. Thank you so much for coming, and good night to you all.
Thank you, Tali.
Thank you, Luke. Thank you so much, again and again and again.
Thank you, Tal. Thank you, Luke. Good night. Shana Tova, Gmar Chatima Tova to everybody.
Shana Tova.
Thank you, Rob.
Thank you, Luke. Thank you, Tali. Thank you, everyone. What an honor, what a privilege. Shana Tova to everyone.